Grand Canyon, Arizona, early spring, 1909. The boat rubbed along the gravel bar and lodged between two half-buried boulders. Frost clung in shaded cracks. The river slid past with slow confidence, pale light catching its ripples and the wet stains on the men's canvas trousers. Three of them climbed out. Edward Carrow, survey engineer for a federal bureau with a name too long for normal conversation, checked the notebook in his pocket for the fifth time that morning. He knew the assignment by heart, but the rustle of paper steadied him. He glanced at the cliff wall beside them, a layered curtain of stone, then toward the narrow crease where a side canyon bit into the main gorge. Thomas Greeley, prospector and dreamer, wiped his hands on his vest and stared up with a miner's hungry eye. He saw ore, future claims, tunnels waiting in the rock. The third man, Elias Boone, geologist, ran fingers along exposed strata as if reading old scripture. He carried a folded government map, a hammer, and more curiosity than caution. The side canyon they had been sent to examine did not appear on public maps. On Carrow's sheet, a faint pencil line marked it with a handwritten note. Cave features, possible cultural or natural significance, assess. The request had arrived in a separate envelope, sealed in red wax and signed by men from Washington Carrow had never met. His superior had watched him read that note and then quietly burned it in an oil lamp. They dragged the light skiff higher on the stones and tied the line to an iron ring hammered into the bank years earlier by someone with the same foolish idea. The side canyon narrowed quickly. Rock pressed close on either side, worn smooth by old floods. They picked their way past boulders jammed like stopped clock gears, past dead brush tangled in crevices, under places where the sky thinned to a pale blue ribbon overhead. Elias spotted the opening first. Halfway up the right wall, a dark oval broke the layered stone. Its outline had a mistaken neatness, an almost perfect curve that spoke of tools more than water. From below it looked like a doorway someone had tried to hide with rock and time. There. His breath smoked in the morning air. Cavity, that must be it. Carrow squinted up at it. No record of a mine here. Greeley slid the pack from his shoulders. Record or not, that is a hole worth climbing to. They unpacked rope and iron. The canyon walls here were treacherous, offering scant holds, but they were stubborn men. Carrow anchored a piton and checked the knot twice. They climbed in a slow, awkward line, boots scraping, fingers catching the smallest of lips and fissures. By the time Carrow pulled himself onto the narrow ledge before the opening, his shoulders burned and cold sweat soaked the band of his hat. The mouth of the cavity waited, no taller than a man and barely wide enough for two to squeeze side by side. Inside lay shadow and a faint glimmer that didn't belong. The glow had the flat sheen of worn metal, not mineral sparkle. Elias hauled himself up with the coil of rope. Greeley came last, grinning until he looked inside. Stone does not do that, he muttered. The floor beyond the entrance sloped inward, coated with dry dust that lay in an even crust, marked only by their boot prints once they stepped across. The walls curved inward, smoother than erosion, scored with thin grooves that swept in arcs. Carrow's training told him formations like this had no business inside this cliff. His job was to observe and write, not declare impossibility, so he pressed discomfort down and counted paces instead. They moved slowly, lantern light pushing back the dark. The chamber ran deeper than the cliff should have allowed, cutting into the canyon wall in a way that ignored the visible layers outside. It felt like walking through the cross-section of a buried cylinder. At the back of the chamber, the rock ended. Metal rose in a curved barrier, dull as old pewter, slick to the eye where lantern glow struck it. Carrow stepped closer and saw that the barrier was not a single smooth piece. Narrow seams crossed it in patterns he could not decipher, some straight, others gently arced, pressed so tight he could not wedge a fingernail between them. He reached out. Elias caught his wrist. Leave it. We do not know who put that here. Caro hesitated, then lowered his hand. We were told to assess caves. This is no cave. Greeley, curiosity wrestling fear, circled along the metal curve until he found a gap where stone met alloy. Cracked rock formed a crooked portal barely 3 handspans wide, opening into darkness beyond the barrier. Light through here. He motioned Caro over. If we can see what lies past, we know what we are dealing with. Caro ducked and pushed the lantern toward the gap. The light spilled through and revealed a second chamber, this one entirely encased in the strange metal. The floor looked level, the walls rounded. From ceiling and floor rose a cylinder the height of 2 men, anchored at each end by thick, jointed struts that flared where they met the shell. Shallow grooves spiraled and looped across its surface like careful carving. Elias leaned in, fascinated. Some kind of engine or furnace. The lantern flame trembled. Caro frowned, thinking of drafts, but felt no wind. The metal under his hand had been cool. Now, as he watched, tongue pressed unconsciously to the back of his teeth. A faint vibration moved through the barrier, a quiver so slight he almost blamed his own pulse. The cylinder inside twitched. Lines along its surface sharpened, standing out against the dull metal. They brightened in sequence, running in bands around the cylinder, then converging along a circle at waist height. "Back!" Caro's voice clipped. "Both of you, back from the gap." Greeley, closest to the opening, glanced over his shoulder with a smirk meant to hide unease. "What, afraid of the pretty lantern trick?" The cylinder locked. Caro saw no moving parts, yet he knew something had aligned. One instant the lines drifted. The next they froze, all of them meeting in a single, smooth ring. A band of pale energy snapped out from the cylinder towards the gap. It came without roar or flash, just a sheet as thin as paper, a faint change in the air from one side of the chamber to the other. It intersected Greeley at the knee. He kept his footing. For the first heartbeat, nothing changed. Then his lower legs crumbled into black, brittle ruin. From the line of impact downward, trousers, flesh and bone transformed into something like overfired charcoal. His boots collapsed inward, cracked, and fell to the floor in chunks. Above the line, his skin stayed pink, the hair on his thighs still pale and fine where it poked through ragged cloth. A cruel border divided living tissue from whatever lay below. Greeley looked down. Confusion flickered across his face just before pain reached him. He made a sound no animal in the canyon had ever made. His body tried to sag, but the ruined stumps would not hold him. He pitched forward, thudding against the metal, caught only by Caro's reflexive lunge. The lantern flew from Caro's hand. It shattered on the metal floor. Oil splashed, flame leapt, then crawled along the cylinder's base and guttered as if something there denied it a grip. Elias grabbed Caro's shoulder. Together they dragged Greeley back from the opening. Fragments of his legs flaked away, leaving more of that dry, black residue on the stone. The machine quivered again. A second surge of pressure ran through the barrier. The walls groaned. Cracks raced across the rock overhead like ink strokes. Stone gave way in slabs. The ceiling dropped in a heavy cascade that barely missed them, slamming into the floor and sealing most of the gap. Dust choked the air. Greeley clawed at the ledge, fingernails scraping stone. His words broke apart into sobs. "Caro, for the love of God!" Elias hauled at the prospector's arms. "Help me!" There was no question of splinting anything. The line where the energy had struck formed a boundary, not a wound. Above it, blood seeped from tiny cracks in skin that tried to swell and could not. Below it, dead matter broke away like fragile plaster. By the time they dragged him to the ledge outside, his face had gone grey, whites of his eyes showing in thin crescents around his pupils. His grip crushed Caro's sleeve with a strength that did not match the blood loss. "Do not leave me up here. Do not leave me in this hole." They didn't. They couldn't lower him with rope. Every jostle sent more fragments dropping away. Climbing down with him was impossible. Elias stayed with Greeley at the opening, tending, whispering nonsense comfort, while Caro descended to the river to fetch help from a camp days away. By the time help could have arrived, Greeley would be dead. Caro knew it. He still climbed down as fast as his hands allowed, fingers splitting, boots scraping. The memory of that clean line across flesh chased him, as sharp and straight as any survey mark he had ever drawn. He reached the boat, bandaged his torn palms without thinking, and pushed into the current. The river took him. He never saw Greeley again. Weeks later, under electric light in a Washington office, Caro sat with bandaged hands and a fresh suit. A thick document lay on the polished desk before him. It outlined penalties for disclosing classified information, cited espionage acts he had barely heard of, and turned his experience in the canyon into the property of the United States government. The men across from him wore crisp collars and watched with that professional absence peculiar to administrators who would never see the places their decisions inspected. "You understand your duty?" Caro picked up the pen. His fingers trembled. He had been instructed to set his account down before this meeting. He had described the chamber in the cliff, the metal barrier, the machine inside, the effect on Greeley's body, and the partial collapse. He had kept to what his eyes and hands knew, and left his fears off the page. Now, as he signed, one of the men took that report, inserted it into a heavy folder, and closed it. A rubber stamp came down near the top of the first page, red ink spreading in a neat rectangle. "Withdrawn from public record." Another stamp marked the folder with a short internal code in black, a string of letters and numbers that meant nothing to Caro, and everything to the system that would shelve it. Caro left the office with his hands still bandaged and his memory officially privatized. The folder did not rest. It moved through cabinets and vaults as years passed, between bureaus that changed names and agencies that changed acronyms, always retaining the same internal code. Men who knew of it aged and retired. Others took their place. The canyon carried on. Summer heat baked the stone. Winter frost split it. The river chewed a little deeper. Flash floods carved new gullies. Rockfalls shifted contours. Trails were cut, then rerouted as geology changed its mind. Midway down one side canyon, an alcove remained high on a cliff face. The entrance narrowed, the stone around it crumbled, but the metal curve at the back persisted, wedged in place. Water and time worked at the seam where rock met alloy, opening the fracture wider by finger widths over decades. Inside, the machine rested. Its outer grooves bore a single ring with one event engraved into it, the memory of a prospector's mutilation written as shallow scars on its shell. In park files that would later become digital entries, certain incidents tied to that side canyon carried a small code in their corner. Drownings, falls, disappearances with plausible explanations, all ending in tidy closure. The code stayed constant even when everything else shifted around it. More than a century after Edward Caro signed his name in that Washington office, the same strip of canyon wall on public maps appeared as contour lines and shading, blank of markers. No cave icon, no note of interest. On a slow winter shift long into the future, a ranger named Daniel Rios would first notice that code and wonder why it kept turning up in the wrong places. At the time, it meant nothing to him. It would. Present day. The helicopter glass wobbled with the turbulence, and so did my reflection. Below us, the Grand Canyon lay quiet and vast, all layered stone and patient depth, but the peace from this height was a lie. I knew every trail where people broke ankles, every ledge where a selfie turned into a fall, every drainage that went from dry to deadly when the weather changed its mind. Work here long enough, and the postcard beauty faded into all the ways the place removed people. My headset activated. "Rios, you with me?" Marcus leaned forward from the seat opposite, face half hidden by mic and sunglasses. He wore the same green uniform and park patch I did, but the lines around his eyes ran deeper. The canyon had taken years from him and left them between his brows. I adjusted my helmet strap just to give my hands something to do. Yeah, running through the gear list again. We'd done that twice already on the pad. Ropes, harnesses, body bags, trauma kit, camera, evidence bags, sat phone. I knew each item by weight and feel. A man needs something to hold on to when he's flying toward dead strangers. Outside, canyon walls lifted past, red and cream layers sliding by. Patches of snow clung to shaded shelves like forgotten laundry. In front, the pilot and co-pilot traded low comments about crosswinds. A laminated checklist dangled from a cord. The helicopter shuddered and settled as they adjusted. "Remind me," I called forward. "Which tour company is this?" The pilot twisted halfway around. "Copper Sky, out of the South Rim airfield." "Flight plan?" "Supposed to stay clear of the inner restricted corridor." He tapped the altimeter with a gloved knuckle. "Dispatch said they were on a photography loop when they dropped off radar." "Then why are we over the corridor?" He grimaced. "Because the coordinates they gave me are smack in it." Marcus met my eyes across the cabin. We both knew what that meant. Some sectors stayed off public maps. Usually it was nesting zones, fragile habitats, cultural sites, places that didn't need more boots. Every map had its own ghosts. An hour earlier, I'd been sipping bad coffee in the break room, watching tourists in bright jackets pose at the rim through the window. The sun had been out but gave very little, the kind of winter day when the wind carries every sound. I'd been counting down my shift. Then dispatch crackled with words you learn to hate. Helicopter. Off radar. No contact. We scrambled because that's the drill. Marcus grabbed me on his way to the hangar. "You're on this one." He yanked a helmet from the rack and passed it over. "You know the south side routes better than anyone." The compliment felt heavier than the plastic. Ben had been at his desk in operations as we passed, scrolling digital maps. He gave me a mock salute with his pen. "Bring me back something interesting." A joke. That was how he carried boredom. The canyon eats people, but if you dwell on that all day, the job sinks you. So you make bad jokes and pretend the next call will be routine. On his monitor, an overhead park layout glowed, colored zones, labels, numbers. One rectangle sat blank, contour lines but no trail data, no labels. A 1 by 2 inch block of canyon that ignored new information. "Huh," Ben tapped it. "That code again." He zoomed in. In the corner of the metadata window, a short internal hazard code sat in a field I'd never seen used for anything else. I leaned over his shoulder. "What is that?" "Some old classification, before my time." He frowned. "Shows up on a handful of legacy incidents. Everyone shrugs when I ask. Might be some ancient training area or old mine, or someone forgot to update the schema." "Get me the coordinates for that blank. Humor me." He rattled the keyboard, jotted them down, tore off the corner and slid it over. I tucked the scrap into my pocket out of habit more than expectation. Half an hour later the call came in, and the coordinates the pilot read over the headset felt familiar. Now, in the helicopter heading toward them, my hand kept drifting to that pocket. My fingers brushed the folded paper, creased from being sat on. "Rios," Marcus cut in. "You good?" "Yeah," I sat back, thinking about tour passengers and how they never listen when the pilot runs the safety brief. Marcus's mouth twitched. "You ever listen when the briefing's for you?" "Of course. I'm very coachable." He snorted and turned toward the open door, eyeing the drop where the canyon floor fell away. The radio activated again, this time with a voice that didn't belong to our airfield. "Park unit, this is regional coordination. Confirm you are approaching Point Alpha." The pilot answered with a call sign. The new voice came. Professional, none of the easy tone we were used to from dispatch. "You are tasked with recovery and scene security. Exclude media and outside law enforcement from the site until federal safety investigators arrive." "Copy?" Marcus frowned. "What federal team is that?" Static hissed then. "National Transportation Safety Board and associated partners." He had no better answer than I did. He held up one finger, the universal hold that thought, and looked back to the drop. The walls narrowed around us. The helicopter banked, following a side canyon. Ahead, a dark notch in the cliff grew wider. There, the pilot pointed, visual on the crash site. I pressed closer to the glass. The wreck sprawled on a stepped ledge halfway up the canyon wall. From a distance, it looked like someone had dropped a silver insect and then twisted it. Rotor blades bent in smooth arcs, curling over the fuselage like broken ribs. One side of the cabin lay open to the void, seats ripped free, harnesses flapping. Charred streaks marred the rock around the wreck, but they weren't the wide, irregular scorch patterns I expected from full fuel fire. Narrow bands of black traced clean paths across stone, some no wider than my hand. The pilot fought the updraft and found a landing spot on a wider shelf a short hike away. The skids kissed rock. We ducked under the spinning blades, grabbed our packs and spilled into canyon silence. The air was thin and cold. Our boots grated over loose fragments as we jogged toward the wreck, breath rasping in our ears. As we rounded an outcrop, the full scene came into view. The helicopter had hit nose first, yet the nose cone was almost intact. The tail boom had twisted into a half spiral, kinked in two neat bends. The main rotor mast lay snapped, blades arranged like someone had bent them into a curved fan. Bodies lay around the wreck like tossed mannequins. The comparison came because of the positions, splayed limbs, tilted heads, clothing still mostly intact. I moved toward the nearest. Middle-aged man, tourist, pastel shirt with a tour company logo. His harness had held. Only the connection loop had failed, sheared clean through the webbing. His right side from shoulder to ankle looked untouched. His cheeks still had stubble. His shoe there was scuffed but whole. His left side from the same shoulder down had been transformed into a crust of black fractured material. The fabric of his pants and shirt on that side had fused into the burnt surface. A straight line ran down his spine, across his pelvis, along his thigh. One side held flesh, the other crackled when I touched it with a gloved hand. Marcus stopped beside me. That is not fuel fire. Agreed. The airframe showed none of the bubbling and sooting I'd seen in other crash photos. Damage followed clean lines, as if a blade of heat had swept through. We moved through the wreck, count bodies, check for any sign of life even when we knew better, secure belongings, photograph positions. A woman hung halfway out of the cockpit, harness twisted. Half her neck and part of her face had that same charcoal texture up to a straight diagonal. Above it, lashes still clung to the lid on the intact side. Her earlobe there still held a small gold stud. Another passenger lay sprawled with both legs burnt away at mid-thigh, trousers intact above that ring. The edges of the damage looked drawn with a ruler. The medic behind us drew a sharp breath and fell silent when training failed him. I tried to focus on what we could control. Tag the bodies, move them to flatter ground for evac. Keep an eye on the sky. While Marcus and the medic worked over the woman in the cockpit, I stepped around the far side of the wreck for better angles on the fuselage. That was when I saw the gap in the cliff. Beyond a short rock rib off the ledge, a narrow shadow sat halfway up the wall behind the tail boom. From most angles, it vanished. When I moved sideways, it opened into a vertical slit. Sunlight caught something inside, a dull gleam behind the shadow. I paused. The part of me with my old drill instructor's voice said, "Stay on task, ignore curiosity, finish the bodies." Another part, the one that got me into trouble, whispered that if there was something there, I needed to know before someone wandered into it blind. "Marcus," I pitched, "there's a recess back here. I'm going to check it, in case anyone got thrown that way." He glanced around the shattered cabin, then up at me. "Do not play hero. Quick look only." "Copy." I picked my way around the tail, boots sliding on loose chips. The rock rib forced me sideways along a narrow strip, one hand on the wall. The gap widened as I drew level, a jagged opening no wider than my shoulders. Cool shade wrapped me as I stepped inside. The floor sloped inward, dusted with a thin layer of granular material that gave under my boots. The walls felt smoother than the outer canyon rock under my gloved fingers. I took 2 more steps and stopped. The alcove glinted in scattered points where my headlamp beam landed. Bones. Fragments at first, small shards, then larger pieces as my eyes adjusted. They lay embedded in the floor and lower walls in uneven layers. Some had the yellow-grey look of old, dry remains. Others retained more substance, like the helicopter victims outside, but broken and partially fused with stone. Mixed among them lay objects. On my left, almost at boot level, the heavy cylinder of a revolver sat half buried in the floor, barrel and chamber rusted into a metal skeleton. Above it, a wide belt buckle of an old style was pinned to the wall by encasing rock. Near my right toe, the rounded corner of an old camera projected from the stone, lens warped and glass spidered. The black box body extended into the wall as if someone had pressed it into soft clay that later hardened. Years separated some of these things, just from their design. They did not belong to a single event. Closer to the center of the alcove, half embedded in the floor, gleamed a small metal tag. I crouched and brushed dust away. A military dog tag. The stamped letters were hard to read under grime, but still legible. I worked it free with the edge of my glove, feeling resistance where the chain vanished deeper into rock in the fused remains of a chest cavity. The chain snapped. The tag dropped into my palm. My headlamp swept further and caught something that stole my breath in its own quiet way. On a chunk of fused floor near the back, a small brass oval protruded. I bent closer. An old park ranger badge. The enamel center still held a faint green tint. The words around the edge matched my own badge in an older font. It remained clipped to the remnant of a leather belt that disappeared into the stone. Each step I took, the crunch under my boots shifted. Old bone, newer bone, dried leather. The alcove floor formed a collage of mortality laid down in thin layers over many decades. The back wall looked like solid rock at first. When my beam slid across it, it caught on a curve that didn't match the rest. The surface there had a dull metallic sheen. It bulged outward in a gentle arc, meeting stone along an uneven line. Faint grooves ran along it, their depths picked out by the light. I moved closer, pulled by a mix of curiosity and dread. Near the base of the metal, a fracture had opened where rock had pulled away over time. Through that crack, deeper darkness waited. "Rios," Marcus's voice carried from the opening. "Where are you?" "In a recess beyond the tail." I stepped back toward the entrance. "Bones and old gear in here. A lot of them." His boots scraped outside, then he stepped into the shade. He looked around. This place never made it into the trail closure notes. I held up the dog tag. Neither did he. He took it, squinting. Military. Could be some old training exercise gone ugly. Several of them. I swept my light along the walls. Different eras. That camera belongs in a museum. His gaze followed mine to the ranger badge. His shoulders stiffened under the uniform. He didn't mention it. That stuck with me more than anything he might have said. "At the back," I started, turning. "There is some kind of..." A vibration crawled up through the soles of my boots, a low, uneven shiver. Dust lifted from the floor in a faint veil. Every safety officer I had ever met shouted in my head. "Back out, now! Screw this!" Marcus grabbed my arm. "We leave this for the investigators." We headed for the exit. While he ducked through the narrow opening, I slipped the old ranger badge free from the rock and slid it into my chest pocket. Stupid. Evidence tampering, technically. It also felt like the only way to keep that fragment from vanishing into another file. As I turned to go, my headlamp skimmed the metal curve at the back. For a heartbeat, thin lines along its surface sharpened. A pattern of grooves came into focus, circling the shell and meeting in a ring at chest height. At the center of that ring, the fracture opened into a darker slit. Something on the other side shifted. Then I was out again, stepping into open air and noise. Our radios activated. "Field team, report status." Marcus thumbed his mic. "Multiple fatalities. No survivors located. Scene secured for now. We've also found older remains and a possible structural hazard in an adjacent alcove. Request guidance." Static ran longer than it should have. Then the clipped voice from earlier returned, cooler. "Understood. Avoid any secondary structures. Repeat, no further entry. Evac body remains, you can safely move. Maintain perimeter until relieved. Do not transmit photographs off-site. Copy. We have procedures for crash investigation. NTSB will want the investigators have been notified." The voice cut in. "You have your instructions. Confirm." He hesitated, then tapped his mic. "Copy." He didn't look happy about it. Neither did I. But we were a long way from anyone else, and whoever held that channel sat higher in the tree than our superintendent. We spent the next hour doing what we could. We moved the bodies we could reach toward the landing area. We tagged positions in our notebooks, even though we'd been told not to transmit photos. The medic grumbled quietly, mostly at the wrongness of the injuries. Wind picked up on the ledge, spinning dust in small spirals. From a distance, the alcove was just another dark shadow in the rock. At one point, while Marcus argued with the pilot over fuel and weather, our radios carried another voice, lower and unfamiliar. "Confirm visual on the alcove." Marcus stiffened. "Who is this?" Static hissed. Then the same clipped dispatch voice returned, calm again. "Disregard that last transmission, cross-channel interference." The pilot, busy with gauges, didn't react. The medic rolled a shoulder and zipped another body bag. Marcus's eyes narrowed behind his sunglasses. He didn't chase it over the radio. When we loaded the first 2 bags onto the helicopter, I caught, just beyond the ledge, a sliver of pale, straight light slide along the cliff face near the alcove entrance. It traced a clean line and vanished. Sun on stone, I told myself. The rock in that cut didn't carry quartz. We lifted off. As the helicopter clawed away from the ledge, I looked down. From the air, the alcove disappeared into the cliff. The wreck lay like a crushed toy, wrapped in the canyon's depth. I had a dog tag in my pocket, a badge over my heart, and the sense that something in that hollow had already hooked into us. I just didn't know how deep yet. The debrief took place in a small conference room at park headquarters that usually hosted safety slideshows and awkward potlucks. The blinds were half closed, muting the canyon outside to a band of color. A coffee urn sat ignored in the corner. A stack of manila envelopes waited at the end of the table. Marcus sat at one end. I took a chair halfway down. The medic from the flight slouched beside me, arms folded. The door opened. 2 men in suits entered first. Federal badges rode their belts, faces set in neutral lines. Behind them came a man in a plain uniform without insignia I recognized. His hair was more grey than black, clipped short. He carried a folder under one arm and moved like someone who'd spent years under load. He introduced himself as Colonel James Harker from the Department of Defense. He didn't bother with "Sir." Our superintendent hovered near the doorway, tenser than I'd ever seen him. Harker opened the folder and slid several forms onto the table. "First, on behalf of multiple agencies, I acknowledge your quick response and professionalism in a complex incident. Your actions met expectations." His gaze moved over each of us. "What you encountered today intersects with ongoing federal research that predates this park. Certain details are now classified under national security statutes. You'll need to review and sign these non-disclosure agreements before we continue." The courtesy carried the weight of paperwork, not kindness. One of the suits walked the table, placing an envelope in front of each of us. I slid mine open. Pages, dense text, legal clauses, references to acts and penalties. Prison appeared more than once. "This is not standard for a crash," Marcus observed. "What you found is not standard." Harker folded his hands. "An investigative body is managing specific hazards in that sector. Your cooperation prevents public panic, and protect sensitive research. You'll still complete internal incident notes, but they'll be filed through restricted channels. The medic shifted. That crash killed civilians on a sightseeing flight. Families are going to want answers. They'll receive answers through proper channels once cause is determined. Until then, all external inquiries go to designated spokespeople. You are not among them. I picked up the pen. After the rescue incident 2 years back, when I'd misjudged weather and route and a hiker had died, I'd sat in a room like this and answered questions while lawyers watched. Those documents had been about liability, not secrecy. Still, the feeling was the same. Your choice is on paper, someone else holding the binder. I scanned the first page. Disclosing what we'd seen without authorization meant losing my job, my pension, my freedom. Refusing here wouldn't dismantle whatever they'd built around that alcove. It would only cut me off from seeing more. My hand moved. The pen scratched. Marcus's pen moved too, slower. When we were done, Harker collected the signed pages, slipped them into his folder, and closed it. Good. Now we're colleagues of a sort. No one smiled. Additionally, he went on, any personal recordings, photographs, or notes you made during the mission are now evidence. We'll collect them before you leave this room. He held out a hand. My phone felt heavy in my pocket. I'd taken only a handful of photos. Habit documenting a scene before the official investigators arrived. He wanted those, and the devices. I handed the phone over. The others did the same. Harker placed them into a secure case one of the suits held, along with memory cards from our cameras. Later today, you'll sign receipts for these items as part of the inquiry. They may or may not be returned. The medic rubbed his face. Can we talk to each other? We're the ones who are there. For now, keep discussion even among yourselves to what you need for operations. Detailed recollection belongs in writing, routed through the proper forms. Translation, Marcus muttered. Keep quiet. One of the suits opened a laptop and started entering our names and badge numbers. The superintendent looked somewhere between nervous and relieved, like a man passing a hot coal upward. When they dismissed us, I walked out into the yard buzzing. The winter sun still hung above the canyon, casting long bands of light and shadow. I dug into my chest pocket and touched the old badge through the fabric. In my pants pocket, the dog tag rested against the lining like a coin. Those I hadn't turned over. My palms itched where I'd pressed them against the alcove wall. I needed distance from fluorescent lights and legal threats. So I headed for the operations building where the radios and maps lived. Ben would be there, hunched over his screens, half annoyed he hadn't been on the flight and half relieved. He looked up as I stepped inside. You were out fast, he stretched. I thought they'd keep you in paperwork prison all day. Do not joke about prison right now. I dropped into the spare chair by his desk. He studied my face. That bad. Wreck was ugly. I've seen fires. I've never seen damage like that. Lines across people. Secondary explosion. More like someone ran a blade of heat through them. He stared. Try phrasing that in a way that doesn't sound insane. I'm working on it. He rolled back to his screens. The park map still glowed, colored overlays and labels. The blank rectangle near the inner canyon remained, corridors of data skirting around it. That's where you went, right? He asked quietly. The coordinates I gave you? He tapped the empty block. The hazard code flashed in a sidebar. Near enough. I pointed to a spot near the border of the blank. Crash ledge was here. There's an alcove beyond it that doesn't exist in your system. He whistled under his breath. This thing again. What thing? That code, this field. He zoomed in. The internal hazard code that had caught my eye earlier sat in a column next to old incident entries. It's attached to a handful of records in the old database, he said. Odd accidents, half documented. Someone digitized them years ago and then locked the structure. I only know it's there because I got bored on an overnight and started poking around. What kind of incidents? He scrolled. 1960s. 2 military personnel unaccounted for during a joint training exercise, later logged as drowned in the river during a storm. But the internal location field lines up with that same blank sector. 1980s. Park ranger missing, presumed dead during flash flood. But the coordinates here say he went out on a trail closure patrol inside your little ghost rectangle. There are more. Name of the ranger. Ben clicked. Miller. First name Paul. The name hit like a fall. Paul Miller had been a legend when I first came to the park. Older than me by decades, lean and patient, with a voice people listened to anyway. He'd pulled me aside after my first near miss and told me quietly that the canyon didn't care about my pride, only my traction. He'd died the year before my first assignment here in what I'd always been told was a flash flood accident. He was in that sector. According to this field, Ben frowned. But the public incident report has him in a totally different drainage. It's like they wrote 2 stories and only published 1. He didn't notice my hand drift to my chest pocket again. You need to be careful where you go with that, I said. His eyebrows went up. Are you warning me as my friend, or as a representative of whatever shadow committee just collected your phone? Both, I exhaled. They had us sign serious non-disclosures. They mentioned a federal program in that canyon segment. If they find out you've been digging through fields they pretend aren't there, you're going to get more than a wrist slap. I'm a federal employee. I manage digital records. That's literally my job. Do you want to keep the job? He fell quiet. The room felt smaller. The hum of old computer fans buzzed. Outside, a group of tourists laughed near the viewing platform, sound faint through the window glass. After a few breaths, Ben leaned closer to the screen again. There's something else, he murmured. I found a reference in the physical archive for that code. An initial report from early last century. It has a withdrawal stamp on it. Withdrawal from what? Public circulation. They used a few different marks for that back then. This one looked old. Single typewritten page with a sketch of a cliff cavity and notes about a prospector getting partially incinerated in some kind of chamber. I thought it was a misfiled mine accident at first. Can you pull it again? His look sat between excitement and caution. You really want to poke that bear? I'm already on its calendar. He spun his chair, stood, and jerked his head toward the back hallway. Come on, while everyone's watching the smoke from the crash. We went down to the archive room. Ben moved like someone who knew every cabinet. He slid open a drawer, thumbed through folders, and pulled one free. The top of the page carried a typed heading with an old bureau name. Below it, neat paragraphs in typewriter font described the discovery of an artificial chamber in a canyon wall, an exposed metal shell, and an incident in which an unnamed prospector suffered partial incineration along a straight horizontal plane at the knees, after bringing an open flame near the structure. The description of the leg damage might have been a photograph from that alcove. At the bottom, a rubber stamp overlaid the last lines, faint but legible, withdrawn from public record. Beside it, the same internal code that sat in Ben's digital fields. He let out a low whistle. I reached for the page, then stopped short of touching it. They know about this, I breathed. They've known since 1909. He nodded toward the top right. Date field. Steps sounded in the hallway. Ben snapped the folder shut and slid it back just as a records tech opened the door, arms full of boxes. One of the suits from the conference room leaned in behind him, gaze sweeping the shelves. You've been busy. Ben spread his hands. Just putting older reports back where they belong. Someone left them on the copier. The suit looked at me. You're not assigned to records, Ranger Rios. I was walking past. Remembered I hadn't updated my emergency contact. I shrugged. Figured I'd ask Park if I needed to do it on paper or in the new system. He considered. New system. Across the board. His eyes flicked to the cabinet. Operational leadership has asked that you two stay out of historical files tagged with certain codes until our review is complete. Classification changes are pending. That includes incident categories you may have treated as unclassified in the past. Ben nodded slowly. You'll want to give us a list of those codes if you expect compliance. That will come through your supervisor. In the meantime, assume anything tied to today's region is sensitive. He watched us a beat longer, then stepped out. As the door swung shut, Ben let out a long breath. That is not ominous at all. My mind went to the alcove, the badge in my pocket, the dog tag, the bone fragments layered like sediment under that metal curve. You're done digging in here for a while, I told him. He stared. You're really in no position to tell me that. I'm in the position of someone who just signed a stack of forms that mention prison a lot. And I'd rather not have to visit you there. He studied me, then nodded once. Fine. I'll let the ancient ghosts sit. He didn't specify how long sit meant. When I got home that night, I emptied my pockets onto the tiny kitchen table in my government apartment. Keys, wallet, the scrap of paper with Ben's coordinates, the dog tag, cool to the touch, the old park badge, enamel worn where years of fingers had smoothed it. The name on the badge stared up at me. Paul Miller. I sat down hard. Paul, who had shown me how to read cloud build and wind, who walked me through my first real rescue, steady voice in my ear, whose death had been explained as a freak flash flood on a side trail. His badge should have been buried or pinned in the small display case the park kept for fallen colleagues, not fused into a hidden alcove floor near a machine I didn't understand. My hands curled into fists on the table. The canyon might not care who it took. I did. The second time we went into that canyon, we were not alone. 2 days after the crash, Marcus knocked on my door before dawn. Briefing in half an hour, full uniforms, bring climbing gear. He looked like he'd slept in a chair. The lines beside his mouth had deepened. Another search. Something like that. At headquarters, the conference room had been rearranged. Screens on rolling stands showed aerial views of the canyon segment, overlaid with red polygons. A large map lay on the table. Around it stood people in uniforms I didn't know, and a handful in plain clothes with lanyards. Colonel Harker held the head of the table. He nodded as we entered, then gestured at the map. Following your initial response, the Interagency Task Group has authorized a controlled assessment of the structure in the alcove. Your role as National Park Service personnel is route guidance, environmental safety evaluation, and emergency support. You are not to engage with the structure. He slid copies of a brief toward us. Sanitized language filled the page. Unnamed subsurface object, hazardous energy emissions, control experiment. A rough sketch showed the alcove, the ledge, and the chamber. The structure at the back appeared as a shaded cylinder with struts, labeled core and interface surfaces. What exactly is this thing? The medic asked, arms crossed. Classified. Harker didn't hesitate. Your need to know covers only risks relevant to your safety. The object emits directional energy under certain conditions. Proximity inside a circular zone triggers activation. The energy can cause severe tissue damage along a plane intersecting the subject's body. You've seen the consequences. We've seen the results, I muttered. You make it sound like a lab device. Think of it as an engine that doesn't share its design notes. Our task is to learn its behavior while minimizing collateral harm. He laid out rules. Safety perimeter distances, no unscheduled entries, radios on specific channels, all photos and logs to be turned over. A new figure stepped forward, introducing himself as Dylan Crane from a private security firm contracted to assist with site integrity. He had the build of someone who'd trained for conflicts in sand and concrete. His gaze catalogued us like equipment. My team controls access to the site. You move when we tell you. You hold when we tell you. Anyone who steps past a barrier without authorization becomes a liability, and we treat liabilities accordingly. We flew in convoy this time. 1 helicopter with rangers and medics, 2 with Harker's people, and Crane's security. Below, the canyon walls received us with the same impassive stone. From the landing pad, the walk to the ledge was shorter now. They'd installed a temporary rope ladder on one side. Crane's men moved, carrying hard cases toward the alcove. Inside the recess, the floor had changed. The brittle layer of bones and fused rubble had been pushed aside in brushed paths. Portable lights on stands threw white columns along the walls, bringing the embedded objects into harsh clarity. Enamel mugs from different eras clustered in one corner. A soldier's helmet fused into the ceiling. A climbing cam trapped half-sunk in a crack. Near the back, engineers in coveralls had set up a scaffold leaning toward the metal curve. Power cables snaked along the floor from a generator outside. Carts of sensors stood nearby, screens full of lines and numbers. Through the widened gap where rock and metal met, the rear chamber loomed. The cylinder inside hung from ceiling to floor, anchored by thick struts. Grooves covered its surface in tangled bands, some deep, some shallow, like layered scars. The center of the floor dipped slightly, as if many heavy things had stood there. One step inside this arc, an engineer pointed to a line taped on the floor less than a dozen feet from the crack. And the system recognizes a live subject. It doesn't always respond, but we assume activation risk. You do not cross that tape, unless directed. He spoke with the easy tone of someone used to giving hazard briefings. I'd given similar talks around helicopters and flood zones. The familiarity over something so unfamiliar made my skin prickle. They brought in the test subject around mid-morning, a sedated goat strapped to a gurney, veins already accessed for monitoring. They wheeled it to the tape and paused while someone checked readings on a tablet. The animal's side rose and fell slow and even. This is a level 1 exposure, the lead engineer said, mostly for Harker. Baseline tissue reaction at minimal charge. Do we really need to watch this? The medic muttered beside me. We're here for safety oversight, Marcus answered quietly. We need to know what this thing does. Crane's men formed a loose perimeter near the entrance, rifles slung, attention trained as much on us as on the machine. The engineers pushed the gurney just over the tape. The change was instant. The cylinder's grooves brightened in sections, first near the floor, then higher. Lines flared and dimmed in a pattern that made no intuitive sense but clearly meant something to the people studying it. The anchors in ceiling and floor vibrated, a low mechanical tremor traveling into the rock. Energy build within expected range. A technician didn't look up from his screen. Field alignment stabilizing. The goat lay limp, unaware. I took a half step back without meaning to. The tape felt like a cliff edge. The grooves converged around a ring halfway up the cylinder. Then a band of pale energy snapped outward. It crossed the chamber in a perfect ring, passed through the goat, and struck the opposite wall. A heartbeat of stillness. Then the animal's lower half, from midsection back, blackened in the same way we'd seen on the crash victims. Fur, skin, bone, and harness straps transformed along a precise plane into brittle crust. Above that line, the goat's upper body stayed intact, ribs still moving. Even under sedation, its body reacted, its back arched. The torso thrashed, driving muscles for legs that were no longer there. A low noise slipped from its throat, thin and raw. One of the younger techs flinched. The lead engineer nodded. Plane alignment precise, charge distribution consistent, good replication. As if this were a manufacturing test, not the ruin of a living thing. They let readings stabilize, then wheeled the gurney back. By the time they reached the neutral zone, the goat's upper body had gone limp. A medic attached to their team checked a monitor and shook his head. Non-viable. Cardiac activity terminated. They covered the remains, logged details, and rolled the gurney out. If this shook Harker, he didn't show it. He watched with arms folded, attention pinned to the machine. I thought of Paul, a ranger who had walked into that alcove with no tape, no briefing, no idea. They ran a second test with a weighted dummy rigged with sensors. The machine's grooves lit in a slightly different sequence. When the band fired, it hit higher, shearing the dummy at chest level. Technicians murmured about energy distribution and predictable response to mass and position. At the tape margin, one tech stepped forward to adjust a sensor and misjudged his footing. His boot heel came half an inch over the taped line just as the grooves flared again. "Hold!" the lead engineer barked, but the machine had already decided. A narrow band of energy arced from the cylinder at a new angle, as if it had recalculated. It grazed the technician from cheekbone down to just above his collarbone. He jerked more from surprise than pain at first. The flesh along that line darkened, charred into that same brittle texture. His eye on that side clouded. The lower half of his face sagged. He made a choking sound and clawed backward, hand grabbing his ruined cheek. Fragments broke under his fingers and fell, leaving more exposed. Then the medic lunged. I moved with him, training older than any urge to respect tape. We reached the tech together, grabbed his shoulders, and dragged him back over the border. Crane's men stepped aside just enough to let us through, their focus on the machine, hands tight on their rifles. The injured technician kicked weakly, one boot smearing brittle residue along the floor. His lips worked, the intact side trying to form words. Nothing coherent came. The medic wrapped what he could, gauze securing the wound to keep fragments from sloughing away too fast. He checked breath, pulse, pupils. I held the tech's good hand, a habit from too many nights in field hospitals. His fingers clamped mine with panicked strength, then eased. "Keep him awake," the medic muttered. "Talk to him." "You're going to be all right. We've got you. Just hang on. They're getting a chopper ready." Half lie, half hope. His good eye followed my voice, trust flickering through the fear. Behind us, Harker barked into a radio for immediate evac. Crane already had 2 men clearing a path. The cylinder's grooves dimmed again, as if the machine had gone back to sleep. I looked at it over my shoulder and felt a cold clarity. The thing didn't care who stepped into reach. Animal, dummy, human, presence and mass drew the same precise response. Harker approached when they'd carried the tech out. "You too." He looked at me and the medic. "You'll file supplementary safety reports on this exposure. Detail any differences from previous incidents." "The difference is that this one was preventable," the medic snapped. "We learn from every mishap. In this case, we refine the safe radius and enforce it. Thank you for your quick response." He still had a pulse when they loaded him. That's more than some of our earlier subjects had. Earlier subjects. This wasn't the beginning of their study. This was midstream. Later, back near the landing pad, Harker asked me to walk with him away from the others. The canyon opened around us. Far below, the river moved on, indifferent. "You handled yourself well in there," he said. "Quick reflexes. You got the technician out of the active radius in time." I did my job. Your job on paper is search and rescue, but your file paints a richer picture. Heat climbed my neck. You were Army before this, combat medic, once. Honourable discharge, triage under fire, then a strong Ranger record marked by one incident 2 years ago when a hiker under your care died during a storm evacuation. He recited it like a report. "I cut a switchback to save time," I said. "Hit a loose slope. He took a fall he wouldn't have taken if I'd stayed on the trail. Investigation found me at fault. They kept me on, with conditions." "Oh, I read the whole thing," Harker nodded. "You had minutes to decide. You chose what looked faster. It went wrong. You've punished yourself more than any board could. That kind of guilt leaves a mark." I wanted him to leave that mark alone. "You care about your people," he went on. "Your fellow Rangers, your community. That came through in the transcript. That's why I'm talking to you. Because I care. Because you care, and you're competent." He stopped and faced me. "We need people like that inside certain programs." The word inside landed heavy. "You've already seen more than most. You've signed. You've proven that you'll step into danger when others hesitate. I can offer you a transfer. Joint task force work, confidential operations, higher pay, better benefits. A chance to influence safety protocols around objects like the one you saw. You want me to help run that thing, help manage it, help limit unnecessary casualties while maximizing what we can learn. That device represents directed energy we don't understand. We can't walk away. Someone will be there. A man with your history can stand inside the program and steer, or stand outside and watch someone less careful take that role. What happens if I decline? His eyes hardened slightly. Then you remain a ranger with an unusual amount of classified knowledge and a blemish on an already imperfect record. If you misstep with that knowledge, if you talk out of turn, you risk criminal charges and loss of your pension. That isn't a threat. It's the structure we work within. What happens to Ben Park? His eyebrow lifted. The records technician? Yes. I know he's been digging in old incident codes. Your friend's browsing habits reached us. He's on administrative review for possible misuse of digital access. There are processes for that. Some involve reassignment to roles where his curiosity is better directed. Roles like what? Extreme environment resilience training, psychological assessments under stress, human trials. He didn't flinch. Ben is young, healthy, single, and inclined to test boundaries. That combination suits some of our protocols. He has no idea what you'd send him into. That's one way to see it. Harker's tone stayed mild. Another is that joining essential work sometimes means accepting risk without full context, something you once did in a different uniform. He let silence stretch. Think about my offer, he said at last. You don't have to answer this second, but understand, this program continues. The canyon stays open. The object doesn't vanish. The only question is whether someone like you chooses to shape how we handle it. He walked back toward the tents and equipment, leaving me with the canyon and my own thoughts. I watched his back and pictured the chamber in my mind. The grooves, the glow, the way the energy band sliced so cleanly. It carried no malice, no intent. It reacted to presence like a flood reacts to rainfall. The cruelty lay in the hands that kept steering people into its reach. At some point I realized my hand had closed around the dog tag in my pocket. The edge dug into my palm. I didn't answer Harker that day. Something in me had already tilted. I found out about Ben's transfer the way you learn most things in bureaucracies, from a memo not meant for your eyes. 2 weeks after the second mission, after more forms and a few vague training modules about joint hazard protocols, I had a new security badge. It granted access to corners of the park network I'd never seen and marked me as something other than a normal ranger to those who recognized the colors. In my email queue one morning, tucked among shift schedules and maintenance requests, sat a message for a small distribution list that included my new assignment. Attachment: a spreadsheet of personnel slated for enhanced resilience training at a facility with a bland name hiding desert behind it. I opened it because my name was on the list. It sat in the column labeled Liaison and Safety Support. I'd be part of the bridge between field operations and test programs. Scrolling, I saw Ben's name under Participant Cohort. Notation: Records Technician, High Cognitive Flexibility, Moderate Risk Tolerance. Lines wavered. They meant to ship him to a remote facility, run him through assessments, and at some point, if he passed, walk him into a chamber like the one in the alcove. Maybe that exact one. Maybe a cousin. The details didn't matter. The pattern did. I left my desk. Marcus caught me in the hallway. "What are you doing?" he asked quietly. "Taking a walk." "In uniform with your badge half showing and your face like that?" He stepped into my path. "You'll start rumors." "Maybe rumors are what we need." He sighed. "Come outside." We stepped into pale afternoon. The canyon beyond the rail looked almost gentle from this angle, snow dusting upper ledges. You saw the memo. Ben doesn't belong on that list. He's a desk rat. He gets winded on the stairs. He's also single, no dependents, good health, no mental health history. Marcus's voice stayed low. On someone's spreadsheet, that makes him a tidy candidate. You know what they're going to do with him. I can guess. And you're fine with that? No, but I've lived long enough to recognize the shape of these things. None of us invited that object into our canyon. Once it was there, decisions shifted above our pay grade. You fight the battles you can win. By letting them feed our own people to it? He looked out at the canyon, hands shoved deep. When Paul went missing, he said, I spent a year waking up every night thinking I should have done more. Called someone, reported someone. Instead, I followed orders. I didn't look too closely at gaps in paperwork because I wanted to keep this badge and feed my family. By the time I could have pushed harder, whatever window existed had closed. That isn't a comfort. It's not meant to be. His mouth twisted. You're not the first to face this choice. The question isn't whether the program goes on. It does. The question is whether you burn yourself trying to smother it or find a way to stand close without letting it consume you. I can't stand by and watch them put Ben on a plane. You think I want that? Marcus's eyes flashed. I've known that kid since his first summer internship. He brought his lunch in a Spider-Man lunchbox. But if you charge this head on, you'll break yourself and nothing else. Then what? He hesitated. Sometimes the best you can do is small damage, nudge a list, delay a shipment, swap a name, keep one person off one roster. It doesn't fix the system. It just means one less body in that chamber. That's enough for you? It's what I can live with. He looked old for a moment. Barely. Wind gusted across the rim, tugging at sleeves. I thought of Ben's half grin, of the technician's ruined face, of Paul's badge on my table. Blowing the whistle, going to the press, would throw me into a grinder built by people with decades of practice grinding inconvenient names. Maybe I'd land one good punch before they buried me. Maybe not. If I went along, took the transfer, I could move inside the program, see rosters, touch levers, pull a name here and there. It wasn't heroism, it was triage. The medic part of my brain understood triage better than anything. You never saved everyone. You saved who you could with what you had in the time you got. I went back in and opened the memo again. Then I picked up the phone. Access buys information. Information buys tiny freedoms. Within a week, my orders for the resilience training program were official. We traveled to a small airstrip in the desert, then board another aircraft to the facility. My cover title, Safety Liaison, responsible for ensuring environment simulations met baseline standards. Ben got his notice separately. He showed up at my door 2 nights before the flight. Hair a mess. Memo crumpled in his fist. You knew. He shoved the paper toward me. You knew they'd pull this. I saw the list. I was going to talk to you. You were going to talk to me. He laughed once, harsh. They're shipping me off to some mystery camp, and you're going along as their pet ranger? They want me as safety liaison. That means I see the hazards before they throw you at them. It also means I might get you out of some. His anger flickered. Fear showed behind it. What are they actually doing out there? He demanded. The memo talks about stress responses and mental toughness. That's recruitment wording. It doesn't mention machines that slice people in half. If I tell you more, you'll sign more forms. You think I care about forms right now? Ben, they don't bring people to these programs because they want to hurt them. They think they can get something powerful from it. But the risk is real. And the hazard isn't just weather or rock slides. There are devices involved nobody understands. I've seen one work. He slumped against the doorframe. Then why am I on the list? Because you poked your nose into a file stack someone wanted left alone. And because you're young and healthy and your profile is too clean. You drew attention. So this is my punishment. It's more complicated than that. He shook his head. I dug because I thought something wrong was happening. I didn't think they'd scoop me up and toss me into it. I stepped aside so he could come in. He dropped into the chair at my tiny table and let the memo sag. Can you get me out? He asked. The worst part was that he asked like he believed I might. I can't erase you from the program, I said. Not outright, not without drawing fire that hits us both. But I might be able to steer what happens when we get there. Or before. He looked at me, eyes bright with anger and something softer. Why are you going along with this, Danny? Because if I refuse, they'll get someone else. Someone who never set foot in that canyon, never knew Paul, doesn't care whether you come home. They run the program either way. I'm gambling that me being there gives us both a better chance. You think you're going to outmaneuver people who've run this since before either of us were born? No, I didn't pretend. I think I might be able to steal one man from the cliff without them noticing in time. He huffed a humorless laugh. That one man being me. In this instance, yes. That's not exactly encouraging. It's the only honest answer I have. He rubbed his eyes. So what's the plan? I don't have a full one yet. I have pieces. They all start with getting on that plane with you. The airstrip lay south of the park, a strip of tarmac cut into scrubland. When we rolled in with the government van, early light had just flattened the hangar's shadow. Ben sat in the back seat, wrists in restraints he'd complained about twice on the drive. Standard issue training clothes made him look younger. Crane's men met us at the gate. Dylan Crane strode forward in tactical pants and a plain long-sleeve shirt, sidearm holstered. He gave me a curt nod, then jerked his chin at Ben. That him? Records technician. Crane's gaze ran over Ben, weighing him. He volunteer for this? The memo's wording is ambiguous, Ben muttered. One of Crane's men nudged him toward the stairs. The aircraft waiting on the runway was a twin-engine transport, no markings, built for short strips, carrying a couple dozen people at most. Inside, plain rows of seats faced forward. A few other men in civilian clothes already sat, looking anxious. A medic I recognized from the alcove mission sat near the front with a tablet. Crane scattered his people down the aisle. Ben ended up in a middle seat. I took the aisle. As the engine spun up, I leaned toward him. You're going to see things you want to stare at, I murmured. Do yourself a favor and act more shaken than you are. Why? People who cope too well get pushed harder. They're looking for limits. If you show none, they'll keep raising the bar until they find one or break you. If you look fragile, they're more likely to sideline you to paperwork. He thought that over, then nodded slowly. I can look fragile. The plane lifted. 20 minutes in, my watch vibrated once. Not a regular alert. A pattern I had programmed tied to one geofence, the alcove's coordinates. I'd tried to shift the training venue on paper in the name of more environmental variables. Officially, I lost. They chose a desert facility. Quietly, someone above that committee had changed course. A routing update on a secure channel the night before showed our flight plan curving back toward the canyon. The watch vibration confirmed it. We weren't going to an abstract facility. We were going back to the alcove. I looked up the aisle. Harker sat in the first row, out of uniform, in a nondescript jacket. He glanced back, met my eyes, and gave the smallest nod. He'd moved his program closer to his favorite object. I tamped down the urge to stand. Instead, I watched Ben fidget with his restraints and let the pieces I did have slide into place around the new route. They wanted Ben in that chamber. They wanted to see what it did to his mind as much as his body. I couldn't keep them from reaching the site. I couldn't bring the plane down. I could, however, use one thing: the canyon's refusal to behave like a lab. There were side paths in and out of that alcove the engineers didn't know the way I did. If I could lead Ben through one of those crannies before they walked him past the tape, we might slip the worst of it, at least once. It wouldn't save every future subject. It might save one. The plane touched down on a makeshift pad near the canyon lip. Rotor wash kicked dust and grit as we disembarked. They moved quickly. Crane's men formed a loose cordon around the participants, steering them toward a command tent. Harker walked ahead, already on a radio. Marcus met my gaze near the edge of the group. He'd come separately, probably to provide environmental readings. The path down to the alcove had been upgraded again. New anchors, ropes for stability, a narrow metal stair bolted into a bad section. Temporary signs marked authorized personnel only, with language that would mean nothing to a random hiker. Inside, the scaffold looked more permanent. They'd shored up parts of the ceiling, more gear, more cables, more screens. The brittle old detritus had been scraped back to bare stone in places and neatly boxed in others. The cylinder in the chamber pulsed with faint bands of light even at rest. They strapped Ben into a harness. He tried for bravado, but his hands shook as they buckled the chest straps. "Remember what we talked about?" I murmured, fitting a monitoring cuff to his arm. "If you feel weird, tell me." "If I feel weird, I think that's going to be obvious." My handheld monitor showed elevated heart rate, quick breathing, normal for this kind of fear. Nothing that would disqualify him. At the tape, Harker faced us. "This is an exposure under controlled conditions. Our goal is to record physiological and psychological responses to proximity. No one crosses into the active radius without clear directive. You will follow instructions. Any deviation is a safety risk and will be handled." He didn't look at me when he said handled. Crane's men tightened the perimeter. My window would be small. Along the right side of the alcove, beyond the tape, a narrow crack in the rock led to a tight bypass that spilled onto a ledge above the main chamber. Maintenance crews had used it once to run cable. Then everyone forgot it. I'd seen it on a diagram and brushed past it in person, feeling faint air. If I could steer Ben that way under cover of adjusting a sensor, we might slip up and out through a ventilation shaft. From there, a rappel line I'd rigged that morning under another pretext would take us to a lower shelf and into a drainage. They'd still find us. But Ben wouldn't be in the chamber. It would be an ugly scramble, maybe ending in handcuffs. That still beat the alternative. Harker gave the signal. "Rios." He nodded at me. "You'll accompany participant Park to the secondary marker. Monitor vitals. If anything unusual happens before the tape, you report and hold." "Understood." "That's me, right? Participant Park?" "Yes." Try not to enjoy the title. We stepped toward the tape. As we crossed it, the machine woke. Grooves along the cylinder brightened in slow bands, climbing from floor to ceiling. The anchors hummed in the rock. The air felt charged, like before lightning without a cloud. My monitor flickered. Ben's heart rate spiked. "Stay with me. Look at me. Don't watch it." He looked anyway. Curiosity was always his flaw. His pupils blew wide. "It's beautiful," he whispered. The word jolted me. "What do you see?" "Lines." His gaze locked on the grooves. Patterns, like a diagram written in light. I can almost read it. The engineers watched their screens. Crane's men shifted. "Park's frontal readings show strong engagement," a tech called. "No distress beyond expected." I tugged Ben's harness slightly toward the right where the crack waited. "We need you closer to that marker. Better angle for some sensors." "Sure." His feet moved as I guided him. The grooves on the cylinder shifted. New lines lit. Others dimmed. The pattern looked like a flattened heartbeat carved in metal. We reached the shadow where the crack opened. "Hold!" I raised my hand as if catching a spike. I frowned at my monitor. "Vitals jumping. I need to adjust his harness." Harker stepped half a pace forward. "You have 30 seconds. Longer in that partial radius without a task raises risk." I nodded, bent over the harness and hissed, "Now." I slid my fingers under a strap, as if adjusting, then grabbed his wrist and shoved it toward the crack. He understood. He twisted as if helping, then turned his shoulder into the shadow and slipped sideways into the opening. The crack was barely wider than he was. I jammed in after him, rocks scraping my hips, one hand hooked on his harness. Behind us, someone shouted, "Rios!" Crane's voice knifed through the alcove. "Get back here!" The grooves flared brighter. The air vibrated. "Go!" I grunted. "Up and right! There's an opening!" He scrambled, hands clawing at rock. The crack angled upward, tight enough to jam us if either hesitated. Fingers brushed my boot. I kicked, catching someone's hand. Rock scraped my shoulder. "Do not fire!" Harker snapped behind. "Ricochets! Block the exits!" They'd seal the top, not risk stray rounds. Ben wriggled through a pinch, yelped as his foot slipped. I jammed my shoulder under him and shoved. "Come on, you spent enough time sitting in a chair. Use your legs." Adrenaline made him climb. He heaved himself up, and suddenly we were through, spilling onto a narrow ledge above the chamber. From here I could see the whole cylinder below. The grooves blazed, encircling it. The anchors thrummed. A band of energy snapped out, but it cut through the alcove where we'd stood seconds earlier. The tape lines scorched black. Crane cursed. "Seal that crack! They're above us." Another band flared, striking a scaffold support. Metal screamed. A section of platform collapsed, taking a tech with it. He tumbled, screaming, as dust and fragments rained down. I dragged Ben along the ledge toward the narrow shaft where I'd hidden a rope. "They'll have men at the upper exit any minute." I dropped a rope down it at dawn under the pretense of checking ventilation. The rope hung there now. "Clip in," I ordered, passing Ben a harness and device from my pack. "Feet on the wall. Walk back. If you let go, you won't have to worry about the program." He made a strangled sound that might once have been a laugh. We went over the edge, boots braced on stone, rope feeding through metal. The canyon opened, vast and cold. Above, the alcove's shadow shrank. Halfway down, rockfall crashed somewhere left. Pebbles rattled past. The machine's energy had shaken more of the ceiling loose. At the base, we hit scree, knees bending to take it. From there, the canyon floor sloped into a narrow drainage leading away from the main path. We ran. Ben stumbled twice. Once he went to his knees and scrambled up, breathing hard. I kept glancing at the rim for silhouettes, telling myself they'd be busy with their own mess. After what felt like an hour, and was likely 10 minutes, a bend cut off the view of the alcove. We leaned against the rock, chests heaving. "You're insane," Ben gasped. "Probably. You realize they're going to kill us for this. They need us too much to kill us immediately." I forced air into my lungs. "You're valuable data. I'm their terrain expert. They'll drag us back, shout and write heavier forms. But you're not going into that chamber today." His laugh sounded more like a sob. "You risked all this for today? I'm not in the business of saving the world. I barely manage myself. One day you're not in that radius counts." He wiped his nose on his sleeve. "You're a messed up man, Rios." Occupational hazard. We pushed on. We didn't get far. The first hint they'd regrouped was the distant thump of rotors. Then, as we rounded another bend, two of Crane's men waited at the bottom of the drainage, rifles slung, expressions carved. "Fun run?" one asked. I lifted my hands. "We were avoiding falling rocks." "Sure you were." He jerked his head. "Orders are to bring you in intact. Consider that generosity." They cuffed Ben's wrists again, tighter this time. My hands followed. They marched us back up the drainage toward a set of switchbacks leading to a different access point than the alcove path. They weren't idiots. They wouldn't march us back past the machine. Harker stood by a tent when we arrived, one side of his face smeared with dust. He watched us for a long stretch. "Do you have any idea how much you just complicated things?" Ben opened his mouth. I shifted my cuffed wrist until it brushed his. "Put it on me." I took him off course. He followed my lead. "It is not," Ben started. I shot him a look. Harker regarded us both. "You think you did him a favor," he said. "You think that by preventing this exposure you spared him. You've delayed a necessary data point." "Necessary for whom?" "For all of us." His tone cooled. "Those devices are not leaving. We can either learn them or face them ignorant. Every controlled exposure is a step toward control." "You call this control? You lost a tech last week. You nearly lost another today. You almost brought the ceiling down on your own people. Progress carries costs. You, of all people, know that." Something brittle in me splintered. "You think in scales," I told him. "Nation scale, decade scale. You weigh one life against hypothetical millions and call it balance. I work at the scale of the person in front of me. I'm a medic. My math is different. Your math is selfish. You save your friend, someone else takes his place. You've seen the rosters. Is Ben the only candidate? For every name you pull off, another fills the slot. He was right. That was the worst part. You're not wrong, I said, but you're not the one who has to look him in the eye later and explain why you didn't pull him when you could. We stared at each other. Harker exhaled through his nose. You forced my hand. I'll have to write this as a behavioral anomaly. They'll trust you less with field roles after this. Good. Put me at a desk. See how much harm I can do from there. He almost smiled, bitter. Don't underestimate what a motivated person can do from a desk. He nodded to Crane. Secure them. We'll sort this out when the site is stable. Crane's grip on my arm lost the earlier faint respect. He squeezed hard enough to bruise as he marched us to a holding tent. Inside, they sat us in folding chairs, still cuffed. A guard took the flap. Ben leaned over, chains clinking. So, he murmured, is this a bad time to mention the buzzing? I stared. What buzzing? In my head, he frowned. Ever since we crossed the tape, it's like a faint ringing, but lower. And every time I close my eyes, I see that pattern. The lines on the cylinder, still there. You were in the radius only a few minutes. Long enough. He rubbed his temples. He didn't seem in pain exactly, more unsettled. Still, the way he described the lingering pattern lodged sharp. They hadn't fed him into the main shot. He'd still picked up something just by standing in the partial field. I thought of the grooves carved into the cylinder over decades, each one a record of exposure. Maybe they weren't only indexing us. Maybe they were also writing back. We sat in that tent for hours. Eventually, the tremors and shouts outside faded. Someone brought water. Crane checked on us once, then left. Harker didn't return. By evening, they uncuffed us and flew us back to the rim under guard. They wrapped what we'd done in paperwork. I received an official reprimand for unauthorized deviation from test protocols and endangerment of personnel during classified operations. My joint assignment stayed but shifted. My role moved from direct canyon work to a broader advisory position at a regional office. Ben left the participant cohort. They labeled him psychologically unsuitable for advanced exposure based on a post-incident evaluation. A polite way to say he'd displayed too much visible distress during our escape to make clean data. He took it as a win. So did I. It didn't change the machine. It didn't change the canyon. Somewhere, another list held names ready to fill the slot he'd just vacated. It changed one line in one spreadsheet for one person. It would have to be enough for that moment. Months slid by. The Grand Canyon turned its usual seasons. Snow, then melt. Spring break crowds. Summer heat that cooked tourists on rim trails. Fall color that drew tripods. I moved to a new office 2 states away. On paper, my job was consulting on extreme environment incident response for a cluster of parks and military training grounds. In practice, I read reports. I watched maps. I sat in meetings about hazard classification and response protocols for scenarios that sounded mundane until you noticed one detail: subsurface anomalies. That was the polite phrase for things like the alcove object. The network of anomalies was wider than I'd guessed. The canyon device wasn't alone. Files hinted at another buried structure in a remote desert, one under permafrost, traces of something offshore. Details blurred under redactions, but the patterns echoed. At my end of the chain, I did what I could. I flagged certain assignments as environmentally unstable to justify pulling young personnel from them. I misplaced a few transfer memos. I rewrote one safety guideline to require higher clearance for live human trials, delaying at least one test. None of it stopped the program. Every time I logged into the secure system, the hazard code from our canyon flickered in some field, a faint watermark on my day. On my desk, hidden under a blotter, lay the dog tag and Paul's badge. I visited Ben twice a week. He lay in a bed in a secure wing of a converted veterans hospital. Officially, his diagnosis mixed anxiety, exposure stress, and localized neurological disturbance. Unofficially, the doctors admitted they had no idea what the energy field had done to his brain. He could talk, joke, read, but sometimes his gaze slipped sideways to somewhere I couldn't see, and he went quiet. "The pattern again?" I'd ask. He'd nod. Sometimes dim, sometimes bright, like someone etched it on the inside of my eyelids. "Does it hurt?" "Not exactly." He'd frown. "If I ignore it too long, I get headaches. So I look at it a while and they ease." I told his doctors that. They nodded, ordered more scans. They didn't tell me what the scans showed. Faint grooves had started to show under the skin of his forearms. Not scars. More like subtle ridges, following curves that didn't match veins or tendons. Too shallow to catch on anything, but visible. The first time I traced one, I felt a strange coolness under the skin, as if something below didn't align with the rest of him. "You're turning into the thing," I muttered. He snorted. "At least my hazard code is unique." If he resented me for dragging him into that canyon, he didn't say it. Maybe he saved that for the dark. I wouldn't have blamed him. He asked me once, during a quiet visit, whether I ever thought about going to the press. "Every day," I answered. And every day I play out the timeline. Headlines for a week, denials, smear campaigns, leaked photos of my worst mistakes. Then a slow fade as people move on to the next outrage, while the program shifts its files an inch deeper under a new name. And you in prison. That too. You think the program survives exposure? Yes, they'd call it a misguided experiment by a few bad actors, hand out token punishments, create new oversight committees, then somewhere, under a different acronym, they'd keep going. The temptation doesn't vanish just because someone shines a light on one room. He picked at a loose thread on his blanket. So instead we rot quietly while they keep carving lines into people. We stall where we can, redirect, replace, save who we can reach. It isn't noble, it's slow, but right now, it's what I can do without being erased. That's bleak. It's realistic. He smiled faintly. I liked you better when your job description was rescuing dehydrated tourists. So did I. More months went by. One grey afternoon, I sat at my desk, monitors glowing with spreadsheets and maps. A new incident summary blinked into my secure inbox, flagged high priority. The header carried the same internal hazard code I'd first seen on Ben's monitor. I opened it. Location: a remote federal preserve in another state, far from the canyon, but still under the extreme environments umbrella. The description mentioned a newly detected subsurface anomaly with metallic density signatures out of step with surrounding geology. Early survey drones had reported a hollow with a curved boundary. In the roster section, a list of proposed personnel for an assessment team stretched down the page. Names, roles, clearance levels. My own name wasn't on it. One young ranger's name jumped out. Mid-20s, recent hire, strong record, no dependents. A version of Ben, 5 years younger, in a different uniform. I sat back. The temptation to print the file, walk down the hall, and start yelling was strong. Instead, I opened my side drawer and found the dog tag. I ran my thumb across the stamped letters until the pressure hurt. Harker had been reassigned after the canyon incident. Another colonel with another name oversaw this file. Different man, same mission. They would keep feeding these things. They would keep taping circles on floors and calling it safety. I leaned forward and clicked into the roster. My clearance allowed certain edits. Not all fields, but enough. I highlighted the young ranger's name. The cursor hovered over delete. Conscience whispered about fairness, about shifting danger from one man to another, about choosing the ones I saved because I happened to notice them. My medic training answered in another language. This man is in front of you, the others are not. You triage what you can see. I deleted his name. Then I scrolled down to the liaison and safety positions. One slot read to be decided. I entered my own. A confirmation box asked if I was authorized to modify the roster. I clicked yes. The change saved. The hazard code waited in the corner of the document like an old bruise. Across the room, a clock ticked. Outside my window lay an office park. Asphalt, scrub, a strip of sky. In my mind, the alcove remained. The metal shell, the grooves, the brittle layers of bone. Paul's badge pinned in stone. The goat jerking on the gurney. The technician's ruined face. Ben's arm with faint lines under the skin that matched patterns on that cylinder. I hadn't destroyed any of it. I hadn't exposed the program. I hadn't redeemed myself for the hiker who died on my watch, or for Paul, or for the nameless soldiers on those dog tags. All I'd done was pull one man off one list, twice. Once, by scrambling through a crack under fire. Once, with a quiet tap of a key. I closed the file. On my way out of the office that evening, I slipped the dog tag and badge into my pocket. The metal settled against my palm, heavy and cool. Outside, the sky over the parking lot turned the color of old paper in the late light. Wind moved over the scrub, ruffling the grass. One image rises when the rest blurs. The withdrawal stamp on that old report, and the realization that for more than a century, every form, every signature, every condolence letter for a training accident or flash flood has been another line in the same quiet experiment. I turned the ignition, the dog tag biting my palm. In the end, I'm one more entry in a long file stamped with the same hazard code, trying to write marginal notes the object will never read.